They said I was quiet, not in the charming way people sometimes are, not in the mysterious romantic way books try to sell it. I was quiet in the way that made people forget I was in the room. The kind of quiet that made others speak over me, dismiss me, or worse, assume my silence meant agreement. I don't remember the first time I realized I didn't matter. Maybe it was gradual, like water wearing down stone. Or maybe it was the day I stood in my mother's kitchen carrying 2 bowls of soup, and no one thought to hold the door. I just stood there, elbow on the edge, balancing both bowls, while the conversation flowed without me. I wasn't 10. I was 37. I remember thinking, this is it, isn't it? This is what it means to be overlooked. I'd grown used to it, being the one who listened while others vented, the one who remembered birthdays no one remembered back, the one who covered extra shifts without being asked because it was easier than explaining why I couldn't. They called me dependable. That was their word. Reliable, hardworking, silent. But dependable people don't get promoted. Dependable people don't get asked what they think. They get given leftover shifts, old offices, worn-out praise. And they get betrayed quietly, too. I didn't see it coming at first, the betrayal. It didn't arrive like a storm. It arrived like a slow leak in a pipe behind the wall. Quiet, persistent. And by the time the damage showed, the structure was already rotten. My name is Anya Blake. I worked for 11 years at a publishing house called Fairweather Press, ironically named, considering how fast they drop people in bad weather. I was the managing editor. Not entitled, that title belonged to someone who came in 2 years after me, younger, louder, with better shoes and sharper elbows. But I did the work. I edited manuscripts until my eyes bled, stayed late to fix author tantrums trained interns who forgot my name by week 2. And I did it all because I believed it meant something. That good work spoke for itself. It doesn't. You have to speak for it, loudly, repeatedly, with confidence that borders on arrogance. But I wasn't built that way. I was the daughter of a seamstress and a mechanic. I was taught to be grateful, not loud, to say thank you, not what about me. So, when the new promotions were announced in that Monday morning meeting with stale coffee and performative clapping, I already knew what was going to happen. 3 people got raises. 2 people got new titles. I got a plant, literally, a potted succulent with a note that said, "Thanks for being our backbone." I wanted to laugh or cry or throw it across the room, but I just smiled, said thank you, and carried it back to my desk like a fool. I told myself it didn't matter, that titles were just words, that respect wasn't printed on business cards. But then 3 weeks later, I found out that my salary was $14,000 lower than Ethan's, the new hire I trained. He once called the Oxford comma snobby and still got a seat in meetings I wasn't even invited to. That was the first crack in the wall. The second came the night I overheard my boss, Lisa, talking in the hallway after our holiday party. She didn't see me. I was in the stairwell waiting for my ride. "She's reliable," Lisa said, slurring slightly from wine. "But she's not leadership material. I mean, she doesn't even speak in meetings. She's just there. I went home that night and stared at my own face in the bathroom mirror. Tried to figure out what just there looked like. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there. It hit me harder than I expected. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true. I had become invisible. And the thing is, invisibility is not always forced on you. Sometimes you build it yourself, with every time you stay silent, every time you say, it's okay when it's not, every time you believe that being good is enough. But something shifted that night. I didn't explode. I didn't file a complaint. I didn't even confront her. Instead, I started writing. At first, just a few notes in a journal, then timelines, dates, emails, comments, every slight, every overlooked contribution, every stolen idea. I documented it all because they were right about one thing. I was quiet, but they never asked what I was listening to, and they never imagined I'd use it. That night, I closed the journal and wrote 5 words on the inside cover. Never assume silence means peace. That was the beginning. I didn't become someone else overnight. There was no makeover montage, no sudden rise in volume or change in wardrobe. I still arrived early and left late, still nodded politely in meetings where my suggestions were repeated and rephrased by louder voices, still said, thank you when I meant you're welcome, but something had shifted beneath the surface. I had started watching everything and everyone with new eyes. I began to notice how often Lisa used my edits without credit, how she copied entire paragraphs of my author correspondence and pasted them into her emails to look more competent. I noticed the subtle ways Ethan undermined me in meetings, little jokes, little dismissals, all said with a smile. I noticed who always got CC'd and who didn't. I noticed how I was always free to help, but never invited to pitch. It was like waking up in the middle of your own life and realizing you were cast as an extra in someone else's movie. I didn't say anything, not yet. Instead, I got methodical, cold, strategic in a way I had never allowed myself to be. I opened a new folder on my home computer, named it for later. Every email, every calendar update, every document I proofed and saved. I backed up everything. I printed screenshots. I dated them. I cross-referenced my contributions with public credits. It was tedious, boring, petty maybe, but it was mine, and it gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. That spring, my father had a fall, broke his hip in the garage, trying to fix a stubborn engine that should have been junked years ago. He hated hospitals, so I spent nights in the guest room of my parents' house, helping my mother lift him in and out of bed, spooning broth into his stubborn, silent mouth. I was exhausted. My job didn't allow for paid caregiver leave, not for editors anyway. I used my sick days, my vacation, worked remotely when I could. Not once did Lisa check in. Not once did anyone offer to lighten my load. But Ethan got to take a week off to go to Aspen. He called it a mental recharge. I envied his audacity. But more than that, I envied his assumption that someone else would always carry the weight for him. No one had ever carried mine. One night, while my father snored softly in the next room, I opened my journal and wrote, even pack mules collapse eventually. I didn't know then if I was planning anything. I just knew I had to keep going. I had to collect truth, like someone gathering dry twigs for fire. It wasn't time to strike the match, not yet, but I needed to know that when the time came, I wouldn't be empty-handed. I started revisiting every moment in my career when I had minimized myself. Every time I turned down opportunities because I wasn't ready or didn't want to be a bother. I thought about the college professor who told me I should consider becoming a writer. I had laughed and said, no one wants to hear from someone like me. But the truth was, I wanted it, desperately. I wanted to be heard. I wanted to exist loudly, even if only once. And yet here I was, editing the words of others for a living, helping them shine while I stayed behind the curtain. Was that noble or cowardly? It haunted me. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I would open the For Later folder and stare at it. It felt like both a weapon and a confession, like I was slowly building my own obituary, or maybe my rebirth. There's a special kind of loneliness that comes from realizing no one's fighting for you. But there's also a strange, fierce kind of power in deciding to fight for yourself. The thing about betrayal is it doesn't have to be loud to leave scars. Sometimes it's the things people don't do, the words they don't say, the chances they don't give you. That spring, after my father began to walk again, I returned to the office full time. I wore darker clothes, tied my hair back tighter. I still smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. People started noticing, not that I had changed, but that they couldn't quite read me anymore. I'd become a question mark, and people hate question marks more than periods. Lisa asked me once, "Everything okay?" And I said yes, but I didn't elaborate. She stared a little too long, then nodded and walked away. I think that was the moment she realized she'd lost track of me. I wasn't a threat, not yet, but I was no longer manageable either. And in workplaces like ours, being unmanageable is worse than being incompetent. Still, I waited, because the next move wasn't mine. I was just laying the groundwork, silently, carefully. Like a spider spinning a web, no one notices until it catches something large enough to shift the entire structure. The betrayal wasn't complete yet, but it was coming. I could feel it, and this time, I would be ready. It began as most humiliations do, with a performance review. The email came on a Tuesday morning, flagged with false cheer. "Time to celebrate your contributions." Lisa had scheduled my one-on-one for Friday 9 a.m. sharp. The subject line read, "Annual Review and Goals." The ampersand was doing heavy lifting. I didn't expect praise, but I also didn't expect to be dismantled so efficiently, so quietly, that I would walk out of that room unsure if I'd ever actually existed there. She smiled when I walked, in that HR smile that says nothing and sees everything. I sat. The blinds were pulled halfway, sunlight slicing the room into polite discomfort. She closed the door behind her, and then it began. "Anya, I want to start by saying how much we value your consistency." That word again. Consistency. The corporate euphemism for invisible. "I've spoken with a few of your colleagues." She continued flipping through notes she'd clearly rehearsed. "And while your dedication is evident, there's been some concern about your initiative." I blinked. Initiative. She didn't look up. In leadership roles, we're looking for voices, for presence, and some feel you don't project the confidence necessary to guide a team forward. I opened my mouth, closed it. She went on. "You're extremely detail-oriented. No one's questioning that. But you tend to stay in your lane." And there it was. I'd spent a decade building that lane, keeping it clean, smooth, efficient. And now it was being used as evidence against me. I nodded slowly, trying to keep my expression neutral. What specific examples were given? Lisa smiled again, tight maternal. "This isn't about placing blame. It's about growth. We want to help you grow." I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. Instead, I said, "So, no promotion." Again, a flicker, then calm. "We've chosen to move forward with Ethan for the senior editorial lead. We believe he brings a more dynamic presence." Dynamic. He once confused there with their in-a-client pitch. I felt a quiet heat rise behind my ears, not rage, something colder. I thanked her, because that's what I did. And then I stood up, walked out, and didn't speak a word to anyone for the rest of the day. But something clicked into place as I stepped back into the hallway. Not pain, Not even anger. It was something like clearance, like confirmation that the story I'd been writing in documents, screenshots, emails, timelines, wasn't a paranoia project. It was real. They were discarding me in stages. I wasn't being overlooked anymore. I was being erased. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't call a friend. I didn't drink wine or rage online. I opened the For Later folder. I added a new section pattern of undervaluing female staff, and I began logging everything Ethan had published under his name that had my fingerprints all over it. Every document metadata file, every track change, every internal memo I wrote that he polished into external language. I wasn't sure what I was building, but I knew it was starting to breathe. 2 weeks later, the first real fracture appeared. One of our authors, a stubborn, award-winning novelist named Eleanor Locke, asked to speak to me directly. Not Ethan, not Lisa, me. She said in front of half the office, "I don't want your boy wonder. I want the woman who actually understands sentence rhythm." Ethan smiled awkward. Lisa flinched. I nodded, calmly, led Eleanor into a meeting room, and closed the door. Inside, she laughed. "I hope I didn't just get you fired." I smiled back. "If I get fired for knowing the difference between a compound modifier and a dangling participle, I'll consider it a graduation." She stared at me a moment longer, then said, "You're not just quiet, you're watching." I didn't respond. She leaned forward. "Good. Because the people who seem harmless, they're the ones no one prepares for." That line stayed with me. Even after she left, the people no one prepares for. I wrote it in my journal that night, underlined it 3 times. From that moment on, the temperature around me changed. Lisa stopped calling me into meetings unless strictly necessary. Ethan avoided eye contact. HR checked in twice in 1 month under the guise of employee wellness. I kept working, quiet, precise, observant, but something in the atmosphere had shifted, like they sensed a storm brewing, but couldn't tell from which direction. The thing is, I wasn't angry anymore. I was something much more dangerous. I was awake. It started as an accident. One night long past office hours, I was sifting through old author folders on the shared drive when I opened something I wasn't meant to see. A mislabeled PDF tucked under a generic name, Q4 Budget Adjustments. I clicked without thinking, and there it was, a spreadsheet, internal salaries, titles, bonus allocations. Not all names were listed, but mine was. So was Ethan's and Lisa's. My eyes froze on the numbers. Ethan's base salary was now $26,000 higher than mine. He'd been at the company 2 years. I'd been there 11. There was no room for interpretation, no excuse about seniority or position or performance. We were both editors, but one of us looked like what they thought leadership should be, and one of us didn't. I should have closed the file, but I didn't. I downloaded it, added it to For Later. Then I sat in the empty office, the soft hum of the ceiling lights above me, and let the silence wrap around me like armor. For the first time in months, I smiled, because they had just handed me the final puzzle piece. That weekend, I began printing, not just emails and performance reviews, but contracts, pay stubs, feedback reports from authors that specifically praised my work. I compiled it all, a narrative built from their own words. Then I started writing a letter. It wasn't a resignation letter, not yet. It was something quieter, more powerful, a memorandum of record, a full accounting of the structural inequities I had endured. Every instance of being passed over, spoken over, taken for granted. I listed the facts, only the facts. No anger, no accusations, just documentation. It read like a legal brief. I didn't send it, not yet, but it was there, waiting. The next Monday, Lisa called me into her office. She had a look I'd seen before, concern pretending to be warmth. "I wanted to check in," she said. "I've noticed you've been a bit withdrawn." I nodded. "I'm focused." She blinked. "Yes, well, just wanted to make sure we're aligned on expectations moving into the next quarter." That was code for don't make waves. I smiled, polite. "Absolutely. I have a clear sense of where things stand now." A pause. Her brow twitched. She didn't like the way I said it, but she couldn't quite put her finger on why. I left the room without asking for anything, and that rattled her more than any demand might have. That night I stayed late again. I wasn't alone. Ethan was in the break room on the phone. His voice was loud, careless, the way people are when they think no one's listening. I mean, she's good at the boring stuff, but she's not a leader. She doesn't even talk. A pause. "Yeah, Lisa basically lets me handle everything now. It's fine. She's not going anywhere. She's like furniture." I didn't move. I just memorized every word. When he left, I stood in the break room and stared at the vending machine. There was a bag of almonds inside that had been there for months. Expired, dusty, unwanted. I looked at it and thought, that's what they think I am. The next day, I printed a transcript of his call from memory, added it to the file, labeled it Perception from Colleagues. Then something inside me changed. I stopped waiting for justice. I started designing it. I reached out to 2 former colleagues, women who had left the company abruptly without much explanation. We hadn't spoken in years, but both responded within hours. Over coffee, they told me stories that mirrored my own. Overtime without pay, credit stolen, promises unfulfilled. They had no proof, but they had memory, pain, clarity. And their stories fit mine like puzzle pieces. One of them, Priya, looked at me across the table and said, "You're not going to let them keep doing this, are you?" I said no, not anymore. She squeezed my hand, then make it count. I spent that night going through everything one last time, organizing, highlighting, numbering. Then I created a document titled The Invisible Editor, a record of workplace silencing at Fairweather Press. It was 72 pages long. I wrote a cover letter, calm, direct, precise, and I attached both to an email addressed to HR, BCC'd to legal. I didn't ask for a meeting. I didn't ask for anything at all. I just sent the truth and went to bed. In the morning, I came in at 8:30 sharp. Lisa wasn't in yet. Ethan avoided my gaze. I sat down at my desk, opened my email, started my day, as if nothing had happened, but everything had. I wasn't afraid, because I knew something they didn't. You don't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes silence is the loudest sound in the room. They didn't respond right away. That was the first sign the letter had landed where it hurt. The usual corporate machine, fast with pleasantries and quicker with denials, was suddenly quiet. No calendar invite. No, let's have a quick chat. Just silence. It lasted 3 days. On the 4th, I got an email from HR. Subject line, confidential follow-up request. Inside a request to meet with the director of people and culture, someone I'd never spoken to before. Not Lisa, not Ethan, someone higher. The meeting was set for 2 p.m. that Friday, a video call, private. I wore a dark blouse and tied my hair back the way I always did, but I added lipstick, a quiet red, the kind you wear when you want to look unbothered but unmissable. When the call connected, the director, Miriam, greeted me gently. She didn't start with small talk. She didn't ask how I was doing. She said, "I've read your report, all of it, and for the first time in years, I felt seen. Not smiled at, not tolerated, seen. I'm going to ask you a few questions," she said, "and then I'm going to tell you what happens next. I nodded. She asked about dates, documents, names. I answered every question calmly, clearly, with references already organized in a color-coded binder beside me. After 45 minutes, she leaned back slightly and said, "You've been documenting this for a long time." "Yes." "Why now?" I paused. Then I said, "Because I was waiting to be worth listening to." And I finally realized that being silent hasn't protected me. It's protected them. By Monday, the dominoes began to fall. First, Lisa was placed on temporary leave. The company used careful language, administrative reassessment, internal restructuring, ongoing evaluation. Everyone knew what it meant. Then Ethan disappeared from Slack, his photo removed, his tasks reassigned, his desk cleared overnight. No one said a word. They didn't have to. The silence was its own press release. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk or seek whispers in the break room. I kept my routine. I drank the same tea, took the same quiet lunch at the window desk no one else liked. But inside, something unfroze. There was space in my lungs again, a way the air moved around me that didn't feel tight. Some of my colleagues avoided me now, unsure of where I stood. Others offered shy nods, hesitant affirmations. A few thanked me quietly. They didn't say what for, but I knew. I had dragged something invisible into the light, and even those who couldn't name it felt the heat of its exposure. Miriam called me back the following week, this time in person. She offered me a promotion, senior editorial director, a raise, a new office, my own team. I should have felt triumphant, but what I felt was tired. 11 years of being passed over. 11 years of swallowing myself down to something palatable, ignorable. And now that I'd bled on paper for 72 pages, I was finally worthy. I didn't want their titles. I wanted my name back. Still, I accepted, not because I owed them anything, but because I owed myself the proof. I wanted to see what it felt like to sit at the head of a table I had built with my own silence. The office they gave me was small, but it had a window. Sunlight poured in around 3 p.m., slanting gold across the carpet, warming the edge of my new desk. It was quiet there, and for the first time, the quiet felt like mine. I began building my team from scratch. I hired people who had been overlooked, women, people of color, neurodivergent editors, the ones who spoke softly but read deeply. We met every Wednesday. We didn't call it strategy. We called it craft. And in that room, we rewrote not just books, but how people were treated while writing them. No one had to raise their voice. No one had to prove they belonged. One afternoon, a former intern stopped by my office. She was one of the good ones, thoughtful, precise. She'd left 2 years ago to finish grad school. She stood in the doorway and said, "I heard what happened." I waited. She smiled. "You always scared me a little. Not because you were mean, because you were so quiet. But now I get it. You weren't hiding. You were waiting." I looked at her. "No," I said. "I was watching." And then finally, I started speaking. People assume that once you've won, everything gets easier. That's a myth. A seductive one, but a myth all the same. What they don't tell you is that after the storm clears, the rebuilding begins. And rebuilding is quieter, slower, lonelier. There's no applause for laying foundation, no headlines for patience. After the HR inquiry ended and my promotion became public, the office changed. Or maybe it was just me that had changed. The temperature of every room shifted when I entered. I wasn't feared, not exactly, but I was studied, like people were waiting to see what kind of leader I'd become. Would I punish? Would I play favorites? Would I become like Lisa, polished, political, performative? I didn't. I became something else entirely. I led like a person who knew what it felt like to be left behind. I paid attention to the eyes that dimmed in meetings, the voices that softened after being interrupted once too often. I knew how to spot the silence that wasn't calm but resignation. I started small. I changed how credits were listed. Editors' names would appear on every public release next to the authors they shaped behind the scenes. I abolished the 9 p.m. Slack pings, made overtime optional and paid. I instituted blind peer review, not just for manuscripts, but for internal promotions. People couldn't campaign or network their way to advancement anymore. They had to be known by their work. You would think there'd be resistance. There wasn't, not openly. But power doesn't like to be redistributed, even gently. One morning, I found a memo left anonymously on my desk, typed, folded, no name. It said, "You're making it too easy for the weak." I stared at it for a long time. I didn't throw it away. I pinned it to the inside of my cabinet door, right above my old journal. Because weakness, the kind they fear, isn't incompetence. It's transparency, compassion, refusing to play the game by rules designed to erase you. The truth is, I still had doubts. Late at night, I'd lie in bed and wonder if it was all performative. If I was now performing strength the way I once performed obedience. Had I truly changed, or had I just learned to wear a louder kind of silence? But then I'd remember the sound of Ethan's voice calling me furniture, and the way Lisa smiled when she handed me a succulent instead of a promotion. No, I hadn't changed. I'd become visible. There's a difference. 2 months into my new role, I was invited to speak at a publishing conference. It was the first time I'd ever been asked to represent the company in public. The theme was Narratives and Power, Who Gets to Tell the Story? I almost said no, but I remembered Eleanor Locke's words. You're not just quiet, you're watching. So I said yes. The morning of the panel, I stood backstage in a navy dress, hands cold, heart steady. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the podium, looked out at the sea of expectant faces, and said, "My name is Anya Blake. I'm the senior editorial director at Fairweather Press. I'm here today because I stayed quiet for a very long time, and I want to talk about what that costs." You could hear the shift in the room, like a held breath, like someone reaching for the volume dial and finding it already turned up. I spoke for 20 minutes about silencing, about the labor behind the stories you love, about the editors whose fingerprints you'll never see in print. I told them about being underestimated. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. I let the truth speak for itself. Afterward, a young woman approached me, maybe 24, nervous, thin-voiced. She said, "I thought I had to be louder to matter." I shook my head. You just have to be heard. And that doesn't always mean noise. She nodded, then whispered, "They think I'm fragile." I smiled gently. Good. Let them think that. Then watch how fast they run when you stop asking permission. That night, back in my hotel room, I wrote a letter to myself. I'd never done that before, but I needed to mark the moment. I wrote, "Dear Anya, they will never see you coming, but you're coming anyway. Stay steady. Stay sharp. You've already broken the silence. Now, build something from the echoes." I folded the letter and tucked it into the back of my journal. Not for history, for me, because I had learned something only the discarded ever understand. You don't have to raise your voice to reclaim your place. You just have to stop whispering your worth. A few months passed. Things at Fairweather settled into something resembling stability. The old tension had mostly dissolved, replaced by a quiet watchfulness, people unsure of where the new balance would land. And in that space, something unexpected began to happen. People started coming to me, not for approvals or edits, but for truth. A junior designer asked if I could help her speak up in meetings. A copy editor confided that they were struggling with depression and afraid it was affecting their performance. A marketing associate left a sticky note on my desk that simply read, "Thank you for making room." I didn't respond to all of them, not directly, but I showed up. I remembered birthdays. I asked about their families. I created silence in meetings, not to dominate, but to allow others to fill the space without fear. I had learned the difference between quietness and absence, and I was determined never to vanish again. Then one Friday, Lisa returned, not to work. She wasn't reinstated, but she came by perhaps to collect the remnants of her old office, or maybe just to see what the place looked like without her fingerprints on it. I saw her through the glass wall from my new desk. Her posture had changed, less certain. Her smile, the one she used to wield like a shield, was smaller now, fainter. She didn't look at me until she was leaving, and when she did, it was brief. A nod. Not quite remorse, not quite resentment. Recognition, maybe. I nodded back. Not to forgive, not to gloat, just to confirm what we both knew. She had underestimated me, and I had let her, because sometimes the best way to learn someone's strategy is to make them think you don't have one. A few days later, I found myself sitting at the coffee shop near our office, the same one I used to hide in during lunch breaks when I felt invisible. This time I sat by the window, notebook in hand, and watched the world move around me. A woman walked in with her daughter, maybe 6 or 7. The girl had a notebook too. She was drawing animals, talking softly to herself. I saw her lean toward her mother and whisper, "I want to be a writer." The mother smiled absently, busy scrolling on her phone. The girl looked away, and I recognized that expression, that quiet ache of wanting to matter. So I tore a piece from my own notebook and wrote, "Writers aren't the loudest people in the room, but they're the ones we listen to when we're alone. Don't stop." When they left, I slipped the note into the girl's open sketchbook on the table. She never saw me do it, but maybe one day she'd find it again. And maybe, just maybe, it would keep her from shrinking. I think about legacy a lot these days. Not the kind measured in awards or job titles, those fade, but the kind that lives in the quiet courage you pass along when no one's watching. The kind of legacy that doesn't need to be loud to last. I used to believe that silence was safety. Now I know better. Silence is a choice. So is being heard. I still write in the same journal. It's nearly full now, not just with documentation, but with reminders of who I was before they tried to erase me, of what I learned standing in the wreckage of my own erasure. On the last page, I wrote, "You were never weak. You were waiting. You were never background. You were the foundation. You were never lost. You were listening." And one final line in red ink, underlined twice. Never assume the quiet one will stay silent forever. Because when I finally did speak, they had no idea what I was capable of. The funny thing about reclaiming your voice is that people start rewriting the past to match your present. Suddenly, I was always a natural leader. I'd always carried the team. I was just biding my time. None of it was true. Not really. I hadn't been biding anything. I'd been surviving, folding myself into the spaces between other people's needs, playing small, not because I lacked ambition, but because I thought smallness kept me safe. Now they saw me differently. So they recast the story. They erased their indifference, their silence, their complicity, and filled the space with new language, trailblazer, mentor, quietly brilliant. I didn't correct them because I had no interest in being the main character of their revisionist history. I was busy writing something else. My workdays shifted. Less editing, more guiding. Less fixing commas, more fixing culture. I led team reviews with one rule: no one gets interrupted. You'd be surprised how revolutionary that is. In my first year as director, we retained every staff member, no turnover. Productivity went up. Burnout dropped. We launched 5 bestsellers. 3 came from debut authors who'd almost quit the industry after being told they were too quiet to be marketable. I didn't celebrate loudly. I just wrote their names in my notebook, one by one. Proof. One afternoon, I received an email from a university professor. She was teaching a course on workplace equity and had read my memorandum, the one I'd sent to HR, the one I thought would vanish into corporate bureaucracy. She asked if I'd be willing to let her use it as a case study. It's not just a complaint, she wrote. It's a blueprint. I sat with that for a long time. A blueprint. That was never my goal. I wasn't trying to start a movement. I just wanted to stop disappearing in my own story. But maybe that's how real change begins. Not with noise. With clarity. I agreed to let her use the document, anonymous at first, then eventually under my name, because I wasn't hiding anymore, and because someone somewhere might be sitting in their office right now, passed over, polite, slowly eroding, and they need to know they're not imagining it. They need to know they're not alone. It's easy to think the battle ends once you reclaim your space, but the truth is silence waits around every corner. It dresses up as exhaustion, as politeness, as fear of being called difficult. Sometimes it sneaks back in through the voices of people who smile and say, "You've changed," when what they mean is, "You stopped making me comfortable." But the difference now is I recognize it. I name it, and then I keep going. One night, late in the office, I found a note on my desk, not typed, handwritten, careful block letters. Thank you for not being loud. Thank you for being sharp. No signature, but I knew who it was from a young editor I'd recently promoted. She rarely spoke in meetings, but when she did, everyone listened. I folded the note and placed it in my journal, next to the one I'd written to myself months earlier. There's a kind of poetry in that the conversation between your past and future selves, folded between pages like pressed flowers. I still walk the same hallway every morning, same building, same desk, same coffee machine that sputters twice before it works. But I walk it differently now. I don't look down. I don't shrink to let others pass. I take up the space I've earned, and the space I was always entitled to, even when I didn't believe it. And some days, when the sun catches the glass just right, and I see my reflection in the hallway window, I whisper a sentence I once wrote, in anger, now spoken with quiet certainty. You were never just there. You were the reason the whole thing stood. It was nearly a year to the day since everything changed when I received a package in the mail. No return address, just my name, scrawled in blocky ink on a brown envelope. Inside, a thin book, self-published, unpolished, with a simple title, What They Never Saw Coming. The author was someone I had mentored, briefly, before they left the company, in frustration, convinced their voice didn't matter. The dedication read, "For Anya Blake, who taught me that silence isn't weakness, it's a gathering storm." I held the book in my hands for a long time, not reading, just holding, as if the weight of it could remind me how far I'd come, how far I'd pulled myself from the deep. I placed it on the corner of my desk, next to the succulent, yes, the same one, Lisa gave me that day as a mock thank you. It had somehow survived quietly thriving all this time. Fitting. Later that week, I gave a talk at a local community college. It wasn't planned. One of our authors had fallen sick, and someone at the press suggested I step in. I almost said no, not because I was nervous, but because I still struggled with being the voice people wanted to hear. But then I remembered all the times I'd sat in those seats, younger, unsure, afraid to ask for what I needed. And I thought, if even one person hears something they carry forward, it's worth the unease. The room was small, maybe 30 students, most of them quiet, a few taking notes, most just watching. I spoke about editing, about language, but somewhere in the middle, I stopped reading from my slides and told them the story. Not all of it, just enough. The part about being overlooked, the part about waiting too long to be heard, and the part where I decided never again. After the talk, a girl she couldn't have been, older than 19, lingered behind. Shy. Hair tucked behind her ears like armor. She said, I want to write stories where nothing explodes, but everything hurts. I smiled. Those are the ones that stay with us. She bit her lip, but I don't think I'm brave enough yet. I didn't rush to reassure her. Instead, I said the thing I wish someone had told me at her age. Bravery isn't loud. Sometimes it's just continuing. She nodded, eyes full, and I knew that moment, quiet as it was, would root inside her. That's the thing about stories. The ones told in whispers can echo longer than any scream. The world still favors the loud, the confident, the polished, but I've stopped trying to compete in that arena. I've built my own. It doesn't glitter. It doesn't trend, but it holds because it was built slowly, truthfully, with the kind of intention that doesn't crumble under pressure. I mentor now, carefully, not too many people at once, just enough to stay present. I always ask the same first question. What's the thing you were told? You're not. Not smart enough, not bold enough, not leader material. We write those down, and then we write what we are. Not what we hope to be. What we already are, even if no one said it aloud yet. That's where we begin. That's always where the real story starts. Sometimes I think back to the version of me who carried those bowls of soup in silence, waiting for someone to open the door. I want to tell her, you won't always be outside the room. You won't always be background noise. One day your silence will thunder. One day the words you gather in private will build something public and unshakable. And when they ask where it came from, your strength, your clarity, your fire, you'll tell them the truth. From everything you didn't hear when I stayed quiet, ChatGPT said Section 10. There was a moment months after the HR fallout, after the conference talks, after the subtle shift in how people looked at me when I almost slipped back. It was nothing dramatic, just a meeting, a routine one. My team and I were reviewing a new manuscript from a first-time author, a memoir about growing up in a family that believed silence was virtue and suffering was legacy. One of the newer managers, a man I hadn't worked closely with yet, interrupted one of my junior editors, not rudely, just habitually, casually, like he was used to his voice being the room's anchor. She went quiet, shoulders pulled in. I saw it all in a breath, and I felt something flicker in me, something ancient, something familiar. That voice that says, stay out of it. Keep things moving. Don't make it a thing. For a split second, I hesitated. Then I stopped the meeting. I looked at him, not harsh, not angry, just direct. I'd like her to finish, I said, nodding toward the editor he'd spoken over. His face stiffened. He muttered something. The room tensed, but I didn't flinch. She resumed speaking, hesitant at first, then steady. And in that small act, the room recalibrated. After the meeting, she lingered behind. I expected a thank you, but she just said, "You saw it." I nodded. Of course I did. She looked down. No one usually does. And that stayed with me, because once neither did I. You don't just unlearn erasure. Even when the world finally sees you, the muscle memory remains the instinct to disappear, to defer, to say, "I'm fine," when you're anything but. That's the real aftermath of silence. Not the quiet itself, but the way it echoes even after you've stepped into the light. So I work against it every day. Gently, deliberately, I make space. I protect pause. I ask twice when someone says they're okay. Not because I'm trying to save them, but because I know what it's like to wish someone had asked again. At home, I started writing again, not in my journal, but for myself. Stories I used to bury. Essays I told myself no one would care to read. Nothing about corporate trauma or HR politics. Just moments, snapshots. The sound of my mother humming while mending a hem. The way my father stood in the garage with oil on his hands and pride in his silence. The way I used to mistake endurance for love. I didn't write them to publish. I wrote them to breathe. Some nights, I'd light a candle, sit by the window, and let the dark wrap around me like a permission slip to feel, to remember, to be. I submitted one of those essays anonymously to a literary magazine I'd admired for years. I didn't think it would be accepted, but it was. And when the editor reached out, she said something that felt like thunder in a whisper. We almost didn't notice this piece at first. It's soft, but then we read it again, and it stayed with us. That, I think, is the quiet revolution, not being the loudest, but being the one who lingers. I keep that email printed in my drawer now, alongside a photo of my younger self, the one who waited too long for someone to open a door. Sometimes I look at her and say, "We made it." And sometimes I hear her say back, "We never left. We were just waiting to be written." It was a rainy Tuesday when I ran into Ethan again. Not at the office. He was long gone by then. It was in a grocery store, of all places. We both reached for the same overpriced carton of oat milk. He looked older, or maybe just less certain. His expression shifted the moment he recognized me. Surprise first, then something like discomfort, a quick recalibration. He straightened his posture the way people do when they remember they once held power and no longer do. "Anya," he said. I nodded. "Ethan." He glanced down at the oat milk, still in my hand, then back at me. "Didn't think I'd run into you here. I live nearby." Right. A silence stretched between us. Not the kind I used to fear, not the silence of being ignored. This one had weight, history, a memory suspended in the air. He cleared his throat. "I heard things changed at Fairweather." I said nothing. He shifted his weight. I was young, stupid. Still I waited. I didn't see it back then, any of it. He laughed once, sharp and small. I just thought I was supposed to win. I met his eyes. "And you thought I wasn't supposed to be playing?" He flinched, just barely, but enough. He nodded once slowly. "You were always watching." I was. "Did you plan it?" He meant the folder, the memorandum, the shift. "No," I said. "I planned to survive." The rest happened when I stopped apologizing for doing it quietly. He opened his mouth, then closed it. A pause. "I'm sorry," he said. And to my own surprise, I believed him, because he wasn't asking for absolution. He was naming what had been broken. That was enough. I didn't tell anyone about the encounter, not because I wanted to protect him, but because I didn't need it to become part of the legend. The woman who stood up, the man who fell. It wasn't a fable. It was just life, complicated, unresolved, real. Back at the office, I added a new line to the sticky note above my desk, the one where I collected quiet truths. It read, "Sometimes the ones who dismissed you will remember you the longest, not out of guilt, but because they underestimated the thing they didn't understand." That week, I met with a new author. She was in her late 50s, soft-spoken with a manuscript about caring for her brother through terminal illness. The prose was raw, unpolished, beautiful in its restraint. She sat across from me, nervously twisting her ring. "I don't know if anyone will want to read something like this," she said. "It's quiet." I smiled. "That's exactly why they will." She blinked, but nothing dramatic happens. "You survive," I said. "That's dramatic enough." Her eyes filled. She looked away quickly. We signed her the next day, and I went home with a familiar ache in my chest, the kind that meant something had just shifted. Again, there's a kind of justice that doesn't wear armor. It doesn't look like revenge, doesn't burn the bridges behind you. It rebuilds them quietly, carefully, then stands at the other end, waiting for the ones who want to cross differently. I'm not angry anymore, not even resentful. I've walked too far to carry that weight. But I remember every slight, every closed door, every time I was made to feel like air, necessary but unseen. I remember, and because I do, I build differently now. Wider doors, softer landings, longer tables. Sometimes I still wake in the middle of the night and think, what if I had stayed silent forever? The answer always comes like breath. You wouldn't be you. It was a Sunday afternoon when I returned to my childhood home, not for any particular reason. My mother had called earlier that week to ask if I could help her clean out the attic. She said it casually, like she always did, as if memories were no more significant than old coats or broken picture frames. The attic hadn't changed much since I was a girl. Same warped floorboards, same dusty boxes, the same faint smell of old paper and mothballs. I climbed the narrow wooden ladder and stepped into the quiet. It took my breath away, not because of the dust or the heat, but because I hadn't realized how much of myself still lived in that room. My old school notebooks, a broken wristwatch I once swore I'd fix, a shoebox full of rejection letters from writing contests I'd entered in college, all unopened. I sat on the floor, knees pulled to my chest, and opened one of the letters. "We regret to inform you." The words felt oddly gentle now, like an echo of a pain I'd already outgrown. I opened a few more. They all sounded the same. Polite rejection. No space for softness. No room for quiet voices. And yet somehow I'd found my way back to words. That evening, as my mother made tea downstairs, I found something else. Something I hadn't realized she'd kept. A folder labeled Anya, Early Stories. Inside were hand-drawn book covers, pages of lined paper with crooked handwriting, stories about birds that couldn't fly but still tried, girls who went unnoticed until they saved the world, animals that spoke in riddles and taught humans how to listen. It undid me, not because they were good, but because I had forgotten I'd once believed my voice mattered without needing permission. There in my childhood attic, I remembered a version of myself that hadn't yet been told to shrink. She was still inside me, just waiting for the right moment to speak again. Later over tea, I asked my mother why she'd kept the folder. She shrugged. "You always had something to say, even when you weren't saying it out loud." I smiled. "I thought you didn't notice." She looked at me over the rim of her cup. "You were my daughter. I noticed everything." It's strange how the wounds we carry from childhood are both tiny and infinite. A forgotten compliment, a glance that didn't linger long enough, a door that didn't open. We carry them like breath, but sometimes if we're lucky, we get to lay them down. Not erase them, just let them rest. That visit was like that. Not a reckoning, not a confrontation, just a soft remembering. Back in my apartment that night, I took out my old journal, the one with the red ink and the vow on the last page. I turned it over and wrote something new on the inside of the front cover. You were brave even then, even when no one knew what to call it, even when you called it nothing at all. That's the truth no one tells you. Bravery doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just showing up to your own life after years of hiding. I didn't set out to become anything. Not a director, not a mentor, not a name whispered with reverence in meetings that once silenced me. I just wanted to stop disappearing. I wanted to live a life that left something behind. Not applause, not accolades, just a clear, steady voice. One that says I was here. I mattered, even when you didn't see me. There's a certain kind of grief that comes not from losing something, but from realizing you never had it to begin with. It hit me one evening, long after the chaos had calmed, long after the HR letters and anonymous notes, long after I had begun to feel, dare I say, it content. I was walking home from a small dinner with colleagues, the kind of gathering I used to dread. Back then, I'd hover at the edges of conversations, laugh politely, excuse myself early. Now I stayed until dessert. I was different. But on that walk home, through streets, I knew by heart a sudden thought stopped me cold. All these years, I was never anyone's first choice. Not for the job, not for the promotion, not even I realized in most of my friendships. I was the fallback, the safe pair of hands, the one you called when someone else said no. It wasn't bitterness that crept in. It was mourning for every version of myself that had worked so hard to be enough, kind enough, smart enough, useful enough, without ever asking if I was wanted, not just needed. I stood still on the sidewalk for a long time. A car passed, then another, and in the stillness I whispered to myself, "You're not a placeholder anymore." That was the night I wrote the piece that changed everything. It wasn't meant to be published. It wasn't meant to be anything, really. Just a raw spill of memory and recognition. I wrote it in a single sitting, no edits, no hesitation. I titled it, What It Means to Be the Quiet One. I didn't send it to a magazine. I posted it anonymously on a blog I hadn't touched in years. By morning, it had been shared over 40,000 times. By the end of the week, it was everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, Reddit threads, titled, This Hit Me in the Chest. They didn't know it was me, and for a while I liked it that way, because it reminded me of the truth I'd always known. It's not about being seen. It's about being felt. Eventually, a journalist tracked me down. She sent a kind email asking if I'd be willing to talk about the piece. She'd guessed it was me. She said the writing matched a few of my known essays. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't afraid. I just needed to ask myself a question I hadn't considered in years. Do I want to be known? That weekend, I went away. Just 2 days. A cabin in the woods. No Wi-Fi. Just me, a notebook, and a stack of unread novels. And the silence. But this time, the silence wasn't empty. It was clean. I stood outside the cabin that second night, wrapped in a blanket, breathing in pine and cold air. The stars were wild above me. I whispered, you were always here. And I meant me, the one no one saw, the one who saw everything, the one who listened for years, waiting for someone to ask the right question. She was never gone. She was just waiting for permission, and I'd finally given it. When I got back, I wrote the journalist back. I said yes. And then I signed my name to the piece, not because I needed credit, but because I wanted every other quiet one out there to see my name and think, She found her way out. Maybe I can too. The interview came out 2 weeks later. It was simple, clean, no dramatics, just me, my words, and the story I had carried for so long it had reshaped the way I breathed. They titled it The Voice Behind the Silence. For the first time, my inbox overflowed, not with contracts or edits or publishing logistics, but with letters, real letters, messages from strangers who wrote like they knew me. A woman from Ohio wrote, "I left a 10-year job last month. I didn't say why. Now I know I wasn't alone." A student from Manila wrote, "I'm 17. I haven't spoken in class for months, but I printed your story and brought it to school." A man in his 60s wrote, "I spent decades being called dependable. Now I understand why that word always made me ache." I read every single one. I responded to most, but I kept one, just one, folded in my wallet. It was handwritten, shaky script. Thank you for telling it the way it really feels. Not brave, not loud, just true. That line stopped something inside me, because that was it. That was the whole point. I didn't set out to inspire or lead or reclaim anything. I just told the truth, and in doing so, gave others permission to do the same. After the article invitations came, conferences, podcasts, writing panels, TED-style talks, I turned most of them down, not out of fear, but because I didn't want to become a symbol. Symbols are hard to live up to. They become mirrors for other people's needs. I wanted to stay a person, so I chose carefully. I gave one talk, one stage, one night. I wore black, no jewelry, no makeup, save for the soft red on my lips that had become unintentionally my armor. I stood at the mic and said, "When people say, 'You've changed,' what they usually mean is, you stopped accommodating the version of you that made me comfortable." A hush fell across the room, and then slowly, the kind of applause that doesn't erupt, it builds. Because people don't clap for you when they feel seen. They clap for the part of themselves you just held up to the light. Afterward, I didn't stay for photos or drinks or handshakes. I walked out into the cold night and took the long way home. It wasn't dramatic. No tears, no revelations, just breath. Just the knowledge that I had in my own quiet way become the very thing I used to look for in other people. Not a savior, not a leader, just someone who didn't look away from the wound. Someone who named it and then began to heal. At the office, things went on. Manuscripts arrived. Meetings were held. Deadlines came and went. But something subtle had shifted. People took longer pauses before interrupting. Junior staff spoke more freely. And sometimes when someone said, "I'm fine," another would say, "Are you sure?" and mean it. Culture is a fragile thing. You can't fix it with policies or slogans. You fix it with presence, with watching, with one person refusing to disappear until others remember they don't have to either. That spring, I began writing a book, not about corporate survival, not about betrayal, just a novel, fiction, but not really. It was about a woman who walks out of her own life quietly on a Tuesday, and no one notices until she's gone. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't redemption. It was a reminder that presence is not permission, that silence is not absence, that stillness is not weakness, and that some of the most powerful stories begin not with a scream, but with a whisper that says, "I'm still here." I didn't expect the book to be published. I wrote it for me. Each night after work, I'd sit at my small kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold and write in slow, deliberate silence. No music, no outlining, just one word after the next, like stones laid in a path back to something I had forgotten: joy. Not victory, not validation, just the quiet joy of making something entirely mine. The main character, Mara, wasn't me, but she carried my shadows, the small hesitations, the learned politeness, the wounds that had no visible scar. And as I wrote her walking through each chapter, I found myself healing alongside her, not because I gave her a triumph, but because I gave her the choice to walk away without apologizing. I finished the manuscript one night in early summer. It was raining again. It always seemed to be during the important moments. The final line came to me with a suddenness that made my chest ache. I typed it and then just sat there, breathing the cursor, blinking at the end, like it too needed a moment to process what had just happened. She was never lost. She just stopped answering when they called her by the wrong name. I cried, not loudly, just a few slow tears. The kind that come not from sadness, but from recognition. A part of me had waited a long time to arrive at that sentence, and now it had. A month later, I sent the manuscript to one of our partner imprints. I didn't use my name. I submitted it under a pseudonym, Elise Hart. Elise was my grandmother's name. Hart was what I thought courage must feel like before I ever found my own. I didn't tell anyone. No back-channeling, no favors. I wanted to know what the story could do on its own, unprotected, unintroduced. 6 weeks passed, and then an email arrived. They wanted to publish it. They called the prose arresting in its restraint. They said the character was haunting, understated, unforgettable. I smiled at the irony that the voice I was once told was not leadership material was now the reason a room full of editors couldn't look away. I told them the truth eventually. After the contract was signed, after the cover design was already in motion, there was a moment of stunned silence on the video call when I revealed that Elise Hart was me. And then laughter, not mocking, joyful. I knew it, one editor said. There was too much quiet precision. I should have guessed. That phrase, quiet precision, stayed with me because it was the first time someone had used quiet as a compliment, not a correction. When the book was released, I didn't do a tour. I didn't sit for interviews. I let the words travel without me. And still they found their way. Book clubs, essays, readers who wrote to say they had never seen themselves on the page until now. And always, always the same phrase. This story didn't shout, but I couldn't stop hearing it. I visit bookstores now, not to see the book, but to stand near it, to watch someone pick it up, flip through it, tilt their head in curiosity. And sometimes when no one's looking, I whisper one sentence to the shelves, the walls, the dust. We're not invisible. We're just waiting to be read. Sometimes, when I pass my own reflection in the mirrored subway doors, I don't flinch anymore. I see myself, not just the present, me not the woman in tailored clothes, with calm eyes and steady posture, but the girl I used to be, the one who held her words like breath, always ready to swallow them down if they made others uncomfortable. She's still here, and now, finally, she knows. You were never too much. You were never not enough. You were just unheard until now. The first time someone recognized me in public, I was in line at the post office. It was an older woman, maybe in her 70s, holding a padded envelope against her chest like it contained something sacred. She kept glancing at me, a little uncertain, then finally asked, Are you Elise Hart? I paused for a moment, then smiled. Yes, and no. She blinked. I wrote, What they never saw coming. Yes, I added. She let out a breath, the kind that comes from holding something inside for too long. I just wanted to say, Thank you, she said. I didn't know someone could write a story like that without yelling. I nodded. Me neither. For a long time. She told me that she had worked as a school secretary for 34 years, that when her husband died, no one noticed how alone she really was, that her daughter had called her so dramatic the one time she tried to explain why Sundays were the hardest. She said she read my book in one sitting. Then she read it again. I didn't feel braver, she said, but I felt not wrong. That's what it had always been about, hadn't it? Not making people brave, but making them feel not wrong. Seen maybe, but even more than that, valid. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, turning her words over in my mind like a river stone. Not wrong. For so much of my life, I had tried to be correct, professional, neutral, balanced, all those sanitized versions of myself that could pass through rooms without creating a ripple. Now I knew better. Correctness isn't the same as truth. Neutrality isn't the same as peace. And silence. Real silence isn't always stillness. Sometimes it's pressure. Sometimes it's survival. Sometimes it's a scream, wearing a softer coat. I began writing again, but differently this time. Not essays, not novels, letters. To no one and to everyone. Short notes. Sometimes only 3 lines. Sometimes entire pages. I'd print them, fold them into small envelopes, and leave them in places I passed on my way to work. One slipped between the pages of a library book, one taped under a cafe table, one left in a dressing room tucked behind the mirror. They weren't confessions. They were invitations. If you've ever wondered if anyone noticed, someone did. If your voice shakes when you speak, keep speaking. You are not invisible. You are simply unspoken. It started to spread. People found them, posted photos online, started writing their own. As are letters from the quiet. One became a hashtag. I didn't attach my name. I didn't need to. The words were doing what I'd always dreamed mine might one day do. Making space for someone else, for the next person who thought they had to shrink to fit the world. For the girl sitting in the back of a meeting, her hands folded tight in her lap, editing her breath. There's a power in anonymity, a freedom even, but there's also a time to step forward, to say yes, it was me. Not to claim credit, but to show your face, so the next person can believe in the possibility of theirs. So one afternoon when I was asked to speak on a panel about the quiet revolution of emotional storytelling, I said yes. I walked on stage. The lights were bright. The seats were full. I sat, crossed my ankles, took a deep breath, and I said, "My name is Anya Blake. Some of you know me as Elise Hart, but long before I had either of those names, I was just the quiet one. This is what happened when I stopped staying quiet for your comfort." There was no standing ovation, just silence, thick, real. And in it, I knew they were hearing every word. There are no credits at the end of a life chapter, no music swells, no final applause, just a moment where something shifts inside you so subtly you might miss it if you weren't listening. And you know, without question, you're not who you were. I stood at the edge of that moment more times than I can count, sometimes in meetings, sometimes walking home, past lit windows, sometimes brushing my teeth, but the shift always felt the same, weightless, not because the burdens were gone, but because they were finally mine to set down. My office now is nothing like Lisa's was. No sleek walls or minimalist art, no designer furniture. It's warmer, messier, more lived in. There's a shelf of dog-eared manuscripts I couldn't bear to send back to storage. A bulletin board pinned with anonymous thank you cards and found poems. A worn-out copy of Beloved sits beside a photo of my parents, younger than I ever knew them, caught in a candid moment, laughing. And on the far corner of the desk, a single sticky note. The very first one I wrote years ago, when I was still invisible to the people in power. Never assume the quiet one will stay silent forever. I don't need to read it every day anymore, but I keep it there like a lighthouse. Because sometimes someone walks into my office, head lowered, voice tentative, and I see myself, not just who I was, but who I still am. I've stopped searching for justice in the places that once refused to acknowledge me. That's not where healing lives. Healing isn't always about getting the apology. It's about no longer needing it to know your worth. I still write, still mentor, still walk the long way home, sometimes just to see the old streets with new eyes. And I still collect quiet things, moments of honesty, letters left behind, sentences that tremble before they settle. The world will always belong loudly to the bold, but there is a quieter revolution happening beneath it, in whispers, in waiting, in women and men who have spent lifetimes observing, absorbing, remembering. And when we speak, we do not raise our voices. We raise the room. I'm not the hero of this story. I'm just the voice that refused to vanish. And if there's anything I want you to remember, more than the titles, the betrayals, the corrections, it's this. We do not have to shout to matter. We do not have to fight to be real. We just have to keep speaking, even if no one claps, even if no one listens yet, because someone somewhere is sitting in the back of the room right now, afraid to take up space. And they need to know their silence is not emptiness. It's a place where something powerful is being built. Some treasures had been recovered. Others more valuable still had been discovered for the first time. It wasn't the ending I'd expected. It was better, harder, clearer, more honest. It was mine. I don't know if the world will ever stop mistaking silence for weakness. I don't know if people like me, watchers, listeners, quiet breathers, will ever be invited in without having to force open the door first. But I do know this. We don't have to wait for permission to begin. We don't have to keep shrinking just because they're more comfortable with us small. We get to exist fully, deeply, even if only in the privacy of our own pages, and that is enough. The story I lived wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice. It was about reclamation. I reclaimed my voice, my name, my story, not to prove anyone wrong, but to remind myself, and maybe someone like you, that quiet does not mean passive. Stillness is not surrender, and silence is not the same thing as absence. Eleanor Thompson, once defined by everyone but herself, finally exists on her own terms, and that I now understand is the greatest revenge of all. Thanks for listening. If you've ever felt the same, betrayed, discarded, or invisible, leave a comment. Someone will hear you. Don't forget to subscribe. Your voice matters.